James is the Director of Training at CAFA Pacifica Centres for Children and Families, Senior Transform Action International Trainer, and LSCI Institute Master Trainer. He presents nationally and internationally and publishes in journals including Child and Youth Care Online, where he is Editor-in-Chief, and Relational Child and Youth Care Practice. James serves on national and international boards, including the American Association of Children's Residential Centres and the International Child and Youth Care Network. I'd like to now hand you over to James for what will be a really exciting presentation. And I know because I've had a sneak peek on reflections and perspectives on touch in current practice.
Today. So here we are at the first in our series, and I hope you can make both this week and next week and some of the fabulous presentations to come in the series after that from others. Today we are talking about reflections and perspectives on touch in current practice, and we'll be doing a few things. Today is primarily reflecting, noticing our own thoughts and experiences with touch. Next week will be more technical and getting into tips and practice guidance around touch. Today we're looking at various perspectives, including our own, and the voice of young people. We'll be looking at a few thoughts about professional thinking on touch, and then through a few short, brief case studies, we'll be looking at our current practice and making some application to our own context. So primarily noticing today in our own experiences and feelings about touch. I'm going to ask a question in just a moment about what messages we might send to young people. Part of the drive to look into this material comes from a conversation with a colleague about a year ago. We had listened to a number of presentations on restraint in residential settings and realized that that was the only context where human touch, human contact, skin to skin, was discussed. And the adults often described it as hands-off policies. That terminology would come up. And what we heard from young people in our experiences was more things like restraint was the only way that I knew how to get a hug, which was a very sad thing. I was recently in a conversation with a care leaver from our program, and she told me when she started to be hugged by friends in middle school in 6th grade, it was just an uncomfortable thing. She hadn't experienced it before, and said it continued even to today. Somebody giving her a hug or even a shoulder bump or something like that. She says it's eased up slightly, but I'm just still uncomfortable. I don't know what to do. As we sat down and chatted, she said her reflection at time in foster care was she wondered what was wrong with her that there had to be a rule not to touch her. And then she said when they did, because she had nice, caring parents, foster parents, when they did, I felt guilty about making them break the rule. So she carried that guilt and that pressure around that was just undue for her developmental stage. So let me ask you the question. You can type in an answer here. What message does an individual get when they're told to avoid physical contact, either from the adult working in a program or a young person? And let's see what sort of shared experiences we can get here. I'll give you a moment just of space to think about that, and go ahead and answer your question right in the window on the screen. Touch is dangerous, someone says. Yes. I think that was a little bit of what my friend was talking about, that she had this sense there's something wrong with me, I'm dangerous, people can't trust me or touch me. I see a few responses about trust, that I can't be trusted, the adult or the child, right? Feels wrong or risky. I think that the risk is an interesting factor, and it'll come up in both sessions today and next week, that often, because we're afraid to talk about this, we leave people without much guidance. Touch is a bad thing, dirty or wrong. I think that's a heavy message that kids internalize at times. I see a few other responses. Don't let people in. That is a heavy one, because kids in trouble are often there because they're isolated, and we often increase that when we have these boundaries of not touching. Someone wrote, touch is risky, something to be fearful of. Staff or adults are afraid of touching me because they don't trust me. You see a theme here that even in our work with young people, regardless of talking about physical touch or not, trust is one of the biggest entry points into their life. Developing, gaining, sustaining, deepening that trust. And the messages that we send inadvertently could be hindering that. Now, somebody said here that adults don't care, or I'm unlovable. Those could definitely be messages sent. And so I think what we're seeing here as a group is that this is important. Whether we touch or not, or whether we have intention in it or not, that sends a very powerful message to young people. Thank you for your responses. Be ready, because we'll be asking you a few more questions as we go. I'm going to move to the next thought here, that is it really fear that's driving our practice? I don't think any of us would decide that we want fear to drive our practice, but let's think about if it may be in some settings. And just a sample of a cycle that could be occurring here. There are some bad things that have happened to young people in care. I don't dispute that, and we want to say very clearly at the outset, abuse, inappropriate touch, anything that harms a child is absolutely wrong and should be harshly and addressed. There are things that have happened. But the bad actions of those few people we've allowed to affect our broader practice. This fear of retaliation or fear of the consequences, as we mentioned in the comments here, often causes us to place protection above nurturing, above care. We become more aware or more concerned about avoiding allegation than meeting a child's need. Things like policies where a child can never be alone with someone, or a hands-off policy, are evidences of those at times. But what that does is it leaves the adults unsure and without guidance, unless the program or school or education program has given some sort of support. The adults on our teams are often left to their own feelings and experiences and how they use touch in their practice. What that does to complete the cycle is that the abuse is furthered because we've poorly addressed a basic human need, a need of nurturing and healthy touch. So in our efforts to safeguard and protect children, we too often define good practice by our fear of accusation or discomfort. Here's the next question we'd like to ask. Have you, in your work with young people, received guidance regarding touch? That guidance might be in the form of a formal training course, such as this series here, perhaps a policy that your organization has that all the adults have read, understood, and signed off on, or maybe it's just in supervision with people. We're interested in the experiences of those that are here. We're seeing as the polls coming in, results are a bit mixed. It looks like more people have received guidance and less people have not received it, which is a great thing. What we don't know is if that guidance has been to avoid touch or not use it, or what that guidance is, but at least we know that some people have received guidance in form of training, policy, supervision. Oh, Nancy says guidance has been to not touch. Okay. Yeah, and in a school setting, that's often the case. Now, even in my own kids' experience, my middle son has some high touch needs, just the way he's wired. And he had a very, his kindergarten teacher was a very touchy person, and they had a great mix. It would really fit well, but he's had other teachers who don't. Sometimes you do have to rebel, Nancy. All right, so let's look at our poll. We've got out of everyone that responded, we've got 78% have received some sort of guidance, and that could be for better or worse. And we've got 21% who received no guidance. So very interesting. All right, so I just want to think here, could it be that we're so afraid of this that we don't even talk about it? And the second reason, as I mentioned one earlier, that we created this content was because we couldn't find it in other places. So let's think of a few things from the literature. This is reaching back 25 years ago to an entry-level text for child and youth care workers from Burns. You see the reference there. Children need physical contact. This is a basic need. It's a presupposition in our work that physical contact is needed to develop. We'll learn next week that kids who don't get it don't thrive very well. And there's also different levels of the strength of need. As I mentioned, my son has a high need for touch, and that gets met in a lot of ways, whether it's wrestling on the floor or the sports team, and others have less. We also know that touch is very culturally, has a cultural context, that some cultures are high touch cultures and some are not, and that it's very individualized. Even as some of the comments come in here that depends on how long you've known the person or the type of relationship. In all of those things, the need is still very present, very there. Burns went on to describe two other basics here, that there's benefit from touch. So it's not only a need, but it's a benefit from the experience. We learn how to interact with others through that, especially within our own cultures. And the second thought here, children need relationships where they're guided about appropriate and inappropriate ways of physical contact. We wonder sometimes why we get teenagers or adolescents that either have too tight or too loose of physical boundaries in their relationships with other people, and often that's based on their early experiences. And here's a final point that is probably relevant for many of us in the care settings that we're working about. Children under stress require more physical contact than usual. Those who've endured early adverse childhood experiences, trauma, challenges, rough starts in life, it's very possible that they need more than what we're giving them And it just makes it all the more confusing about why our field doesn't address this as much. We want to give you one current resource here, Growing Edge Training with Mark Fredo and their new monthly journal, Thriving. Larry Brintrow put out a brief article in there just a few months ago on Touch, the Foundation of Belonging. And so if you look at Evelyn's post, you'll see a link to that if you'd like to read or follow up with that after the webinar. So we're going to do a mindfulness activity here. And when we do a mindfulness activity, I'm going to ask you to set aside your own judgments about yourselves and about your focus. And I'd like you to just sit back and just absorb some of the photos you're about to see. We'll show you a series of images. At the end of them, I'm going to ask you for a word or phrase or perhaps a caption to one of the images that comes to mind for you. And here we're just exploring the elements in ourselves about our own feelings, emotions, thoughts about touch. So as they come up, I may give just a moment of silence for you to absorb the image, but also point out some elements related to what the people are doing in the picture. In this first one, we see a child who's likely initiating this contact with someone older than herself. You really see this child leaning in and pressing in to the adult. You notice there's a happiness there. The heads are touching, which is a real sign of intimacy. Two individuals here, you see the adult has brought themselves down to equal height for the child's eye level. The child's leaning in here with their full body. You see the full weight of this child pressed into the hand of the adult, and the adult supporting the child in the other hand. Group of teens here, 5 of them, taking a selfie, as many do. Notice they're leaning in together. Some of their heads are touching, especially the 2 or 3 in the center. Another sign of intimacy there. Hands crossing over each other, shoulders touching, everyone smiling. And we move here inside of a home. Notice here the adult who is wearing a symbol of what some might see as power and authority has brought himself down, in this case, underneath the eye level of the child. This might be a moment here of being away and returning. We don't know the context of that, but notice the child's initiating some contact on the arm, the adult's initiating some contact around the upper leg. The cultural and geographic context here. Notice the closeness of this family and the need regionally to be protected from weather, to be close. This child has probably grown up from her early days tucked in a nurturing way inside of something like this. There seems to be a joy of being snuggled up and close. Not sure who's initiating the contact here, but you see a kiss on the cheek, a smile on the girl, the arm around the adult. The adult here, tattoos for some of us might be represent an image of strength or affiliation or artistic expression. He's entirely wrapped himself around this young person, this child. Could be for comfort, could be for protection. She's a recipient there of that embrace. Our 2 Islamic girls here, or perhaps Omani, 2 peers, notice they're leaning into each other, arm on the shoulder. One seems to be, there's a deep affiliation here as they even attempt to dress similarly. Here the adult's pulling in the young person. See the arms around her back, bringing her in for an embrace. The child's wrapped her arm around the head of the adult, very intimate here, hug or embrace. And our last image, thinking of the Championship World Cup events that are happening in these weeks, but here's a moment of celebration, close contact, arms around each other, embracing. It's even difficult to tell whose arm is who in this moment. So here we have a peer-to-peer exchange. Here's all our images, and looking for your response. I see some have entered in the chat here. If you have a word or a caption or thought that comes to mind with these pictures, go ahead and enter it in the text on the screen. Some that I see in the chat box are joy, happiness, together, friendship, intimacy, consoling, safety. Absolutely. I'll give you just a moment here to think about what you might caption or phrase some of these and enter them in the box there. Family. Some of these are some of you might think these are family and maybe not in a group care setting. We wanted to explore all of them here. Necessary. Some of these moments that are captured. Imagine if you were the adult there and were working in a hands-off situation, and what that message would communicate when you pull back or not touch. Needs being met, a connection between emotional and physical need. And some of these really capture that. Connectedness, all is well. Connection of hearts and souls, love. Someone said genuine. There really is a naturalness to these experiences here. So in this mindfulness exercise, we won't go into another question here, but just to put for you, is there any discomfort in these? If you were to picture yourself in some of these settings, with people that you've worked with over time. And if you notice that, just notice it, let it be there. Today's about reflecting and understanding our own experiences. Togetherness. Yeah. Mutual comfort or support or protection may be challenging in some settings, absolutely. Both in some settings and with some youth or adults, because it's so individual. Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me in that activity, that mindfulness sort of reflection on our own projection for what we see. Let's keep that noticing going and move from our own reflections and own experiences into some comments from young people. Over the last few months, colleagues and I have surveyed young people and captured some of their perspectives. This was a young person in our program who lived in one of our transitional homes, and she says, I don't remember any physical contact with my birth mother. My first experiences were negative. There was physical and sexual abuse in the home that made being touched confusing. She went on to explain that confusion about touch carried over into relationships with others as she got into the teen years. She never knew what touch meant. It was either control for her or abuse, and nurturance was hard for her to find. Another young woman said I needed to be taught about what was appropriate and not appropriate. Even though I did not learn about healthy touch, I looked for it. So there you see that need driving her. I looked for it with boys and became pregnant at 16. Life-changing experience there. She continues, I would have valued the touch of a mother figure. So here in this young person's reflection, she's realizing that her experience today was shaped by some of those early experiences and now lives with consequence of that, which for her was a thing of joy, but definitely something unplanned and challenging. Another young woman said, I developed crushes with older men. I didn't know about boundaries, and I saw staff as intimate because they took care of me. We learn from our experiences. Those experiences shape who we become. The one thing that this young person interpreted was that caring is intimacy, and it is. But for her, it became very difficult to interpret and understand intimacy in life as she got older. Final thought from a youth here, and then we'll ask you a question. This girl was very happy to describe her experiences. She said, I have thick, frizzy, crazy hair. And one of the female adults in her program, she made me feel special because she would straighten my hair every Sunday night while we listened to music and talked. I felt loved with this kind of touch. As she described this experience, this was an extra time that she got. Other kids didn't have this need with their hair, and they often sort of were on her case about why she gets this special attention. But her and the adult would sit on the couch, her on the floor, staff behind her, leaning against her legs, and would straighten her hair. And that, to her, even today, describing what happened over a decade ago, brought just a joy and warmth to her as she expressed that. So we're going to put a box here for you to enter something, right? We've listened to the experience of young people. What's been your experience? Just a short phrase or two. It doesn't have to be a complete thought. But something that describes your professional experience of positive touch. So we heard before about policies of not touching. Here's a chance for you to share with the group what's been your positive experience with touch in your work setting. I see Gordon as a response here. Many young people are at significant risk of sexual exploitation. Very true, and for many reasons. One of which being where they can get appropriate intimacy from their alternative carers. We do want to protect and prevent abuse, absolutely. There's some thoughts coming in. High-fiving, bumping fists with teammates is inspirational during a difficult time. Peer-to-peer contact and adult-child contact. Those are easy ways to begin to meet that need. Hugs, prompts, special handshakes, and half hugs with students on the autism spectrum. Absolutely. Thinking about definitely individual and unique needs as well. I remember one of my early experiences working in disability camps, summer camps, especially thinking of young people with autism. Getting surprise hugs from the back, bear hugs, and learning how to respond to that. Brushing. Somebody wrote, natural mutual comfort between adults and children, supported by their organizations and supervisors. A lot of wisdom in that. Notice that there's a mutual need being met, mutual comfort. It goes both ways. And it's definitely within the containment of the organization and supervisor guiding that practice for safety. Someone wrote familiarity, relationship, camaraderie, individualized to your relationship, adapting. We'll get into some of that next week as well. How do you really evaluate and respond to the feedback we get from a child? All right, excellent. Thank you for those of you who were able to put thoughts in there as we've thought about young people's experiences themselves and our own. I see somebody added normalizing as well. It's very normalizing, especially in an institutional setting. And it goes back to that thought from Burns that touch may be even more important for children under stress. Absolutely. All right, well, we'd like to move into our final phase here of looking at some experiences described by carers and in the context of child and youth care. These case studies that we're going to look at, and there's 3 of them that are quite brief, they come from a brand new dissertation from Scottish Lisa Warwick at University of Nottingham. We're going to put the link to that in the chat box if you'd like to read that entire thesis. We're dipping into it with these field notes that she collected in her research as the basis for these case studies. And then next week we'll also be looking at her classification of touch, how that can give us some guidance on the different types of touch in that. So a wonderful dissertation. Highly recommend that for those who would like to do some additional reading. So in just a moment, I'm going to play a recording of an adult here reflecting on his experience at night out on a lake with a young person. I'd like you to listen to it and ask you a question at the end of what the touch that was initiated here, what did that communicate to Joshua, the young person? So here I'll play Chris.
I took Joshua night fishing. I took Joshua night fishing. We sat in 2 chairs, side by side, next to the lake. Nobody around. The sun is setting, and he went through his life. From when he could remember to now. He shared some painful memories that he had. Life at home and away and such. Not only did it upset him, but it upset me. So we put our arms around each other. I think it just brings you a bit closer. I think it really shows them that you know what they have gone through. I just think it means a lot for them to share all that information and then for you to be there for them. And it means 1,000 words, you know. A touch on the shoulder. Or a hug.
Touch can mean 1,000 words. It communicates a lot. So the question you'll see on the screen here is, what exactly did that touch communicate to Joshua in that moment as they sit there, arms around each other? What do you think the message was from the adult to the young person in this special moment that unfolded? I'll give you a moment of space here to think about that and enter it in to the box. Few answers coming in. It communicated that he's valued, cared about, communicated that the adult was there for them. I'm feeling with you as we are in this moment. Communicated trust, understanding, caring, worth, not non-judgment. Someone entered, we are connected, and that's a good thing. We are together. Things that almost difficult to put words to what that action communicated in that very moment. I'm right here alongside you, friend, so it's okay to share. Communicated that he is seen. Absolutely. When Chris says touch means 1,000 words, I mean, there's a whole depth and meaning that was communicated and made by Joshua in that moment, in that touch, that put so many words together. We've got several answers there. Is it? I guess Evelyn. I guess we click broadcast to share those.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Ernie, Tom, you should be able to see those now. All right. And so I've read some of them, but you can scroll through and see all that was communicated in that moment, at least in our meaning making of our perspective here. And of course, the meaning that was made from the adult and what he intended is one thing, and then the experience of the young person was the other side of that. The meaning that he interpreted and made from that interaction. So all of this is a point of nurturing and communication that in some contexts would have been missed, because they would not have been allowed to be out alone at night on the lake, and touch would have been prohibited. Of course, some of us may work in a context like that, and we have to figure out that role. As somebody said earlier, maybe we'll rebel against that rule. Others may find that that's the context we work in. But given here, we find a moment that was very special and communicated something. Gordon added, a moving tale reminds me of help from someone with grief when I was a child. An endless hug with no words. It communicates something that we just can't put words to. So here was a very positive and very nurturing experience of it. We'd like to move into another one in a group care setting that described both maybe some inappropriate touch and, for this person at the very least, uncomfortable situation that she didn't know what to do with. I want to ask you in a few moments if you've ever been in a situation like this that was uncomfortable, and just think as we hear about why the discomfort.
It was not here at this home. It was at another home before. It was a boy, a teenage boy, and he had made a comment beforehand about shutting me in the room so he could try to rape me. But he was laughing, so I was just like, oh okay, you should not be saying stuff like that. And then he gave me a big hug, a really big hug. And he actually squeezed me that tight. I could feel myself pressed against him, and that was really uncomfortable and awkward.
So here you have issues of gender, age, intention, all coming in to something that, for one, was left in an uncomfortable situation. So the question here is, have you been in an uncomfortable situation like this? I'm not going to ask you to describe it in this context, but just to see it, how many of us have been put in a situation where touch created some awkwardness or discomfort? I see answers coming in, and we'll give you just a moment to think about that and click your response. And again, and just thinking that as people are responding here, some of the discomfort here part of it came from the way that touch was used. It seemed like the child initiated it, but the meaning making came from the joking that preceded that. His intent to harm her, but given through laughter. So a joke, what we might say, not helpful or inappropriate in some way. The adult trying to redirect that, trying to give some guidance, but quite vague in it, and it resulted in that moment of discomfort. So we've got some responses. Let's see what we've got here, the broadcast. So we've got 73% or so, 2/3 of us saying yes, we've been in an uncomfortable situation like this or related to it. And about 1/4 of us saying no, we haven't been in an uncomfortable situation. So one of the things that we'll think about next week is how do we process this? If we're uncomfortable, do we need to get out of that and end the discomfort, which is one option? Or if we're in it, do we hold for a moment and notice that feeling and respond to it? And all kinds of questions come out of that. Do we tell the child at that moment, I'm uncomfortable? Do we talk later about that? So it just kind of shows the complexity of touch from both sides. I see some comments. Touch is very powerful in both positive and negative ways, absolutely. All right, so we've had an experience of nurturing that was received, and we have an experience of discomfort from the meaning that was made in a hug. And now here we'll enter the living space of a group home. This will bring up some life space context to it. I'd like you to notice a few things as we listen to this explanation here from a third person. Patrick is one of the young men who lives in this home along with Sam and Joshua. There's 2 adults here. There's Chris and Rachel. They're all watching something in the living room, the living space, living area. And this is about a moment where Patrick enters the room and sits next to Rachel. And I'd just like you to hear in the context the naturalness, the authenticity, and how this is handled.
So, it was later on that same evening. Rachel, one of the workers in the house, she is sitting on the sofa. That's when Patrick, he's 16, he walks into the common room. He jumps backwards onto the sofa, and his head lands next, like right next, to Rachel's leg. She moved a cushion over onto her leg, and Patrick nudges up to put his head on the cushion. Rachel then stroked Patrick's forehead, and they sat for around 30 minutes. We were all there. Sam, Joshua. They were about the same age as Patrick. And Chris, another worker. They were all in the room. Rachel and Patrick were chatting along with everyone, and the mood was quite upbeat. After a while Patrick closed his eyes and fell asleep on Rachel's legs.
So here we have that what some might see as intimate, some might see as crossing a boundary. But just to summarize, Patrick on the couch leans against Rachel's leg. She responds to that by moving a pillow, a cushion, between the two of them and lets him lean on that cushion. In a nurturing way, she strokes his forehead, and they sit there for about half an hour with other people around. Imagine if you were another coworker or supervisor and you walk in at that moment. You have to absorb that context and see what's happened and who it is and make meaning of that yourself. And the question we'd like to put up here is a multiple choice question. What do you think a common response would be from Rachel? If you might have handled this different, or what do you think a common reaction would be? A number of things. She could get up from the couch. She could move Patrick physically away from her if she was uncomfortable with that. She could slip and move down the sofa or get up and walk away from the sofa. What would be a common response you would see among your colleagues in that situation? And if you have a different one, you can add that right in the chat box. I see somebody wrote anxiety went up, of course. Every time I listen to this one, mine does just a little bit, not knowing the context. For some, this pushes a boundary a little bit, and that's kind of what we wanted to just notice and explore, is where would our comfort level be in that? Someone else wrote, this makes me smile, we need to touch, but we need to teach appropriate touch, and I think this is a good example of this. Definitely. All right, we've got some poll answers in. We'll broadcast those, and it looks like most of you, a little less than half, thought that moving down the sofa would be a common response. And none of these are wrong, and it's not right or wrong what she did in that moment. We're just noticing and reflecting on it. But if she did sit up and move down the sofa, that would have communicated something. And that's the point here, is that our response communicates a message. The second place answer was move Patrick's head so he's sitting up right next to her. I think in most of the work settings I've observed, local to my context, I think that probably would have been one. The staff would have reached over and physically moved Patrick and said, no, here's how we sit. So that's sort of imposing a boundary on Patrick that isn't quite so natural in that. One of the responses here, common responses that definitely depend on context where one works, and just letting it go, letting it flow might be one. Nancy asked the question, what meaning do the other kids make of this? Definitely, we've got not just Patrick, but we've got the other kids in the room, and what does that communicate? Sort of ties back to the young girl who had the hair brushing on Saturday evenings with the adult in her program. She was teased a little bit by others, but it was out of a sort of, as she described it, a sort of jealousy. Like, why don't I get that time? You get something that we don't. And I thought that was an interesting reflection, and quite normal in family life with our own kids. That when needs are met, sometimes others look at it that way. Janice added, it shows she doesn't want to get away from him, but to just move over. So she adapted, she welcomed, she provided a place for him. I think the pillow really helped create some sort of boundary so that seemed appropriate for the context. For me, Christy writes, it's an invite to connect and engage positively, appropriately. And we're hearing something and stepping into the life space of this. It's likely, very likely, that this has happened before and very normative because of the way it's described. And many of us in the field would agree that this culture of care, this culture of caring, which is what we do in our work, is often about blurring boundaries a little bit. It's about being on the edge of those boundaries. That's why it's so important that we get training and support and supervision in both meaning making and interpreting and context and communication and all of that. I was recently talking with an adult who worked in a care home, and she was on the other end of the spectrum here from Rachel. She was talking about what she wore to the home, and she had different clothes that she wore to the home than what she would normally wear, which is fine. But her reasoning was, it just makes me feel awkward when I mix those clothes. She had some sort of boundary that she had made in her mind of presence in one place was messy, which group living is, but she didn't want that to contaminate, that was a word she used, the rest of her life. And the clothes was just one place where that came out in a very clear and objective way. And that was something that she needed to explore and figure out why. So last comments I see coming in the chat. For me, it's an invite to connect, engage appropriately. Someone here says, I might lean toward negotiating another kind of touch with Patrick. Absolutely, depending on our own uniqueness and the child, we might handle that in a different way. I think Tom writes here, without speculating, I would want to explore what it meant to Patrick. Yeah, absolutely. I was interviewing adult and child in a group setting recently, and as we were interviewing, the child reached over and grasped the adult's hand, and she put a second hand above him and just sort of rubbed his hand as we talked. And it was so natural and so welcome by the two of them as I just observed it and noticed it. And very natural, something that a mother would do to a child or a father to a child. And those moments like that of reassurance or just comfort can be missed in the care setting. So excellent. Thank you for responding to that. I want to look at just a glimpse of what's to come if you are able to join us next week. And as we do this, Marie's invited you to share any thoughts or reflections on the entire hour in the chat box. But thinking ahead, we've done a lot of reflecting today on our own perspectives, on youth perspectives, looked at some case settings, case studies in different settings. And hopefully that's brought a new awareness to you. That's really the goal of today, to think about touch in our context. What we're going to do next week, if you have already signed up, that's wonderful. But thinking ahead, we're going to move from this introspection and reflection and look at a few lessons from history that we know from research, including things like Spitz and Harlow and Romanian orphans, briefly. We're going to look at Warwick's classification of touch. So if you really want to know, especially as a supervisor, worker in a group setting, there are a dozen different types of touch that can be classified, and look at what ones we want to avoid and what ones we want to increase. And then from past writing from Tom Garfat, we'll look at a few practice tips for our organization, guidance in that. And I'll wrap that up by giving you a sample policy for nurturing touch if you wanted to integrate that into your program. So that's what's ahead. And I see the thanks, Nancy, for the virtual high five there to everyone. Love it. I see a number of people saying they're looking forward to next time. So we will be together again. And Marie, I hear you coming in? Or Evelyn?
Yeah, that was me.
All right. I'll give it back over to you.
Thank you. I would just like to say thank you very, very much to James for a wonderful presentation. That was really superb. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did too. Really looking forward to next week. Well, I would be because I know what it is. No, it's a superb, it really is. It's a superb follow-on. It's really good. And could I say thank you to Marie for co-hosting as well? And thank you to everybody for attending. You've been absolutely wonderful, and you have populated the chat and given us lots of comments and lots of material that we can work with and take away from it. I think so. I think it's been a really fruitful session from everybody's point of view. Thank you to everybody.